This is a dramatized reflection, created from composite situations to explore family dynamics, rather than a report of real events, and the characters' places and moments are fictionalized composites shaped for clarity, restraint, and healing within a reflective narrative voice intended for thoughtful listeners seeking perspective rather than spectacle or accusation. A few years ago, that fall dinner began quietly in a small Chicago restaurant with linen napkins, water glasses, and a server placing the leather billfolder beside the menus while my father stood, lifted his glass, and praised my brother as the responsible one before the room settled again into polite applause from everyone present. I clapped too, because that is what I always do when praise moves away from me and expectations slide toward my chair. The server stepped back, and no one reached for the folder. My father looked at me and asked softly if I could cover everyone's share tonight right now. The shock was not loud, it was internal, like a door closing without a slam. I felt the familiar pause where I ask myself whether to speak or smooth things over. Doubt followed, because this had happened before, and I wondered if I was misreading it again quietly tonight here. Over the next few minutes, my thoughts unraveled into recognition as years lined up behind that folder. I saw graduations, holidays, and dinners where my brother was admired and I was dependable. Responsible sounded noble, yet it kept pointing at me like an arrow I carried alone every single time before. I did not argue at the table because confrontation would have turned truth into theater. Instead, I paid and listened to the silence expand between us. On the drive home, resistance formed not as anger but as clarity. Something had shifted, and it would not return to normal again soon. 2 weeks later, at Thanksgiving with relatives watching, I chose precision over volume. I stated what responsibility had cost without embellishment, names, or blame. Numbers landed, and the room changed without anyone being shamed. That was the exposure. The truth simply stood where it belonged in shared light for once. The aftermath was quieter than the conflict as habits adjusted and my wallet closed. Months later, my brother called asking for help, and I declined with one sentence. The consequence arrived naturally and without celebration. Boundaries were held, and the request ended cleanly, this time without anger or triumph at all anywhere. Looking back, I understand that justice was the refusal to fund choices that were not mine. Healing followed slowly through dignity, routine, and rest rather than applause. Peace arrived when expectations lost their grip. I breathed and moved forward without paying for belonging again, ever by default in silence. Finally, if this resonates, pause and notice where responsibility crosses into extraction in your own life. I share this reflection to invite steadier choices and calmer boundaries. Wherever you are tonight, you are not alone. The story continues with what followed. Stay with me here as we go on together quietly. In the days after that dinner, I kept replaying the moment, not to rehearse an argument, but to understand why it felt so familiar and why the weight landed on me without a single raised voice. I have always been the one people describe as steady, which sounds like a compliment until you realize it means you are expected to absorb whatever shifts in the room without changing its shape. Growing up, I learned early that calm was useful, and usefulness became a quiet currency I spent without noticing. When my brother took risks and talked about big plans, the family leaned forward with interest and encouragement, and when I kept my head down and followed through, the room relaxed as if order had been restored. Over time, that difference hardened into a pattern that looked normal from the outside. I was not unaware of it, but I was practiced at explaining it away to myself as timing or temperament or the price of peace. It helped that the requests were rarely dramatic. They arrived as assumptions wrapped in praise and framed as temporary favors that never quite ended. I did not think of myself as a martyr, and I did not feel resentful then because resentment requires a sense of choice, and mine felt narrow. Each time I stepped in, it seemed reasonable in isolation, and I told myself I was being practical, not compliant. That belief kept me comfortable enough to continue. What unsettled me after the dinner was not the money, but the ease with which the role reappeared as if it had been waiting patiently for its cue. I wondered whether I had trained everyone, including myself, to expect it. That question stayed with me as I went about ordinary days, answering emails, buying groceries, finishing tasks, and noticing how often reliability is mistaken for consent. I began to see how praise had been used like a soft glove to move responsibility from one place to another without discussion. It was never stated outright that I should carry more, but the room always tilted until I did. I also saw how my silence had been interpreted as agreement rather than endurance. That realization brought doubt not about my worth, but about the story I had been telling to keep things smooth. If you have ever been called the strong one or the easy one, you may recognize the way that label expands until it fills every space. It asks you to be available rather than respected, and to fix rather than decide. I did not hate anyone for this, and I was not looking to prove a point. I simply wanted to understand the system I was participating in and whether I could step out without breaking myself or the people I cared about. That curiosity marked the beginning of a shift because once you name a pattern, it stops being invisible. I was not ready to confront anyone yet, and I did not need an audience. I needed clarity and a way to move forward with dignity intact. If this sounds familiar, pause for a moment and notice where you learned to be dependable and who benefits most from that lesson. In the weeks that followed, I began to notice how the small moments added up into something heavier than a single dinner bill, and how often the imbalance hid inside ordinary celebrations. Birthdays arrived with cards addressed to my brother, praising his courage, while I was asked to handle logistics quietly because I was good at details. Graduations passed with speeches about potential and vision, and afterward, I paid for rides home or picked up groceries because it made things easier for everyone. Each incident on its own seemed harmless, and I could have explained it away as a coincidence or personality. Together, they formed a ledger I had never written, but had been maintaining for years without review. The language around it was always gentle. I was thanked for being organized and trusted to take care of things as if trust itself was the reward. When I paused or hesitated, the room shifted slightly, and someone would remind me that this was not a big deal and that family helps family. No one ever asked whether help was being distributed evenly or whether admiration had become a substitute for accountability. I also noticed how responsibility was assigned backward. The person celebrated for bold choices was shielded from the consequences of those choices, while the person praised for steadiness absorbed the costs. That inversion did not happen by accident, and it did not require malice to persist. It relied on habit and my willingness to keep the peace. I did not frame this as injustice at first, because injustice sounds loud and confrontational. What I felt was a slow accumulation of expectations that arrived before consent. They came wrapped in smiles and phrases about harmony and timing. If I raised a question, it was met with reassurance rather than answers. That response trained me to doubt my perception and to file away discomfort as oversensitivity. I see now how gaslighting can be quiet and polite and still effective. It does not deny facts outright. It reframes them until you question your reaction. Over time, I learned to anticipate needs and meet them before they were spoken. That anticipation was rewarded with approval, which felt good enough to continue. Yet the cost showed up elsewhere in missed plans, delayed goals, and a constant background hum of responsibility that never shut off. I did not resent my family, and I did not want to punish anyone. I wanted fairness, clarity, and a way to participate without being assigned the heaviest load by default. As these realizations stacked up, the doubt hardened into recognition. This was not about generosity or love. It was about a system that worked smoothly for some, but others kept it running without protest. Naming that system did not make me angry. It made me careful. I began to understand that continuing as before would be a choice, and that choice would carry consequences for my future. The question became whether I could step back without becoming the villain in a story that depended on my silence. Recognizing this did not erase affection or history, but it changed how I evaluated requests and praise alike, and how I measured my own participation. I stopped treating every ask as urgent and every compliment as proof that the arrangement was fair. I started watching how quickly relief appeared when I agreed and how tension lingered when I paused. Those reactions taught me more than any argument could have about where balance truly lived. That awareness marked the accumulation phase, where injustice became visible without accusation or spectacle to me very clearly. In the days when I began to pause instead of agreeing, the responses shifted in subtle ways that were easy to miss if you were not looking for them. When I asked a simple question about timing, I was told not to overthink it, because this was not the moment to make things awkward. When I mentioned a limit, I was reminded that I was better with money and better at handling stress, and that everyone trusted me because I could manage it. Those words sounded kind on the surface, yet they moved the focus away from the request and onto my character, as if the problem were my hesitation rather than the imbalance itself. If I pressed further, the conversation softened and then closed. Someone would say we would talk later, or that this was just how families worked. Nothing was denied outright, and that was the point. By the time the exchange ended, I felt unreasonable for having asked at all. I started noticing how quickly reassurance replaced discussion and how often praise was used to smooth over unanswered questions. It was not that anyone lied. It was the frame that kept shifting until my reaction felt like the only thing out of place. I told myself I was being sensitive and that harmony mattered more than precision. That belief kept me compliant while allowing everyone else to feel generous. The gaslighting was quiet and efficient. It did not require raised voices or insults. It relied on timing and tone and the assumption that I would not want to disrupt the mood. Each time I deferred, the pattern strengthened, and the language grew more confident. You are so reliable. You always understand. "We count on you." Those phrases arrived whenever I hesitated, and they worked because they appealed to my identity rather than my consent. Over time, I learned to preempt the conversation by agreeing before the words were spoken. That habit felt like kindness, but it functioned like erasure. I also noticed how accountability dissolved in these moments. When outcomes were positive, the credit flowed toward ambition and vision. When outcomes were costly, the responsibility drifted toward me without discussion. If I questioned that drift, I was told I was making things transactional or keeping score. That accusation stung because I had never kept a ledger. I had kept relationships afloat. Still, the doubt crept in. I wondered why fairness was framed as conflict, and why boundaries were treated as a threat. I wondered why my clarity needed to be postponed while others' decisions were celebrated immediately. These questions did not make me angry. They made me cautious. I realized that as long as the conversation stayed abstract, the imbalance could continue indefinitely. So I stopped arguing the abstract and began to observe the concrete. I watched who relaxed when I agreed and who tensed when I paused. I watched how quickly the mood recovered once I said yes. Those observations grounded me. They did not turn me against anyone. They simply removed the fog. By the end of that phase, I understood that the gaslighting was not about convincing me of a lie. It was about keeping me from trusting my own clarity, and that insight prepared me for the next step without bitterness or spectacle. In the quiet, after all of that, I did not explode or collapse, and that absence surprised me because I had expected a wave of anger or grief to announce the change. Instead, the break arrived as a clean line drawn through my habits. I noticed how calm followed my first deliberate pause, and how nothing fell apart when I let a request sit unanswered. The room did not end, and the sky did not dim. That simple observation loosened something tight in my chest. I began to see that my role had been maintained by motion, and that stopping even briefly revealed how much energy it required to keep it alive. I slept better during that week, not because problems were solved, but because I was no longer rehearsing explanations. The internal shift was practical rather than dramatic. I asked myself what would happen if I chose clarity over comfort and answered honestly without preparing for disappointment. The answer was not catastrophic. It was quiet. I realized that I had been measuring love by my usefulness, and that measure was incomplete. Care does not require self-erasure, and responsibility does not mean automatic agreement. Those thoughts settled without urgency and changed the way I moved through ordinary hours. I delayed responses. I read messages twice. I stopped anticipating needs before they were expressed. Each small choice returned a fraction of attention to me. I did not announce boundaries, and I did not issue ultimatums. I simply adjusted my pace and watched what surfaced. What surfaced was telling. When I slowed down, anxiety appeared elsewhere in the room as if my motion had been propping it up. That was not my fault, and it was not my job to fix. Accepting that felt like crossing a threshold. The break was internal because it did not ask permission. It did not require an audience. It replaced reflex with intention. I felt less generous and more honest. And that honesty felt steadier than generosity ever had. I did not become hard. I became precise. Precision reduced noise and revealed choices. I could still help when I chose to help, and that distinction mattered. It returned dignity to decisions that had been automatic. By the end of that phase, I understood that change did not need a speech. It needed consistency. I was no longer preparing to argue my case. I was preparing to live it. That preparation was quiet, and it was enough. I held that line privately and let days pass until certainty replaced habit, and the calm remained steady. Nothing dramatic happened, and that absence became proof. I was changing without spectacle, and the work was sustainable. The break did not end the connection. It redefined it in terms I could keep without shrinking myself or asking for permission again. It allowed me to proceed with care and courage while protecting peace and preparing for what came next with a steadier sense of self and no need to rush any decisions. Thanksgiving arrived with the usual choreography of coats and casseroles and familiar greetings exchanged in a living room that held too many memories to count. Relatives filled the space, and conversation drifted toward safe topics as plates were passed and chairs pulled close. I took my seat with intention and not defiance, and waited for the moment that I sensed would come because it always did when enough people were watching. It came quietly when my father began a story meant to be warm and flattering about how my brother had always been the responsible one, the person who could be counted on when things mattered. Heads nodded and smiles appeared, and the words landed as they always had. This time, I did not rush to fill the space that followed. I let the sentence finish and the room breathe. Then I spoke without raising my voice and without turning toward anyone in particular. I said I wanted to be clear about what responsibility had looked like for me over the past few years, and why that word carried weight I had never named aloud. I did not accuse, and I did not dramatize. I listed facts the way you would read directions or share an update. I mentioned dinners I had covered, travel I had arranged, and deposits I had fronted so plans could move forward smoothly. I said the amounts without emphasis and paused between them so no one felt rushed to react. I made it clear that I had done these things willingly at the time, and that my intention had been to help, not to keep score. Then I stated the part that mattered. I said that when responsibility is assigned without conversation, it stops being shared and becomes expected. And that expectation changes relationships. I did not look for agreement, and I did not wait for apologies. I simply finished the thought and returned my attention to my plate. The effect was immediate and contained. The room shifted as if a draft had passed through an open window. No one laughed, and no one argued. A few people looked down, and a few looked toward my brother with curiosity rather than judgment. That was the exposure. The truth stood in the open where it belonged, and no one was singled out or shamed. I did not add commentary, and I did not justify my timing. The moment held, and then moved on. Someone asked for the salt, and conversation resumed in a new register that was careful but not hostile. Later, as dishes were cleared, my mother spoke to me quietly and said she had not realized how it felt, and I thanked her for listening without inviting further discussion. That was enough. I did not explain more because the explanation had already been given to the room that mattered. The drive home was uneventful, and that uneventfulness felt like confirmation. I had not made a scene, and nothing had broken. Over the next few days, small changes appeared without announcement. Requests were phrased as questions, and timelines were discussed rather than assumed. The shift was subtle and incomplete but real. I noticed it and stayed consistent. I did not correct the past or ask for repayment. I closed the loop by changing my participation going forward. When the next plan came up, I declined politely and offered an alternative that fit my capacity. The response was restrained, but respectful. That response mattered more than agreement. The exposure had done its work by establishing a shared understanding that had been missing. It did not make me the hero of a story, and it did not make anyone else the villain. It reset the terms in public where private patterns had thrived. I did not feel triumphant afterward. I felt lighter and steadier, as if a weight had been set down without ceremony. Justice in that moment was not punishment. It was accurate. It allowed each person to see the arrangement as it was and decide how to proceed with that knowledge. I continued to show up with care, and I continued to say no when needed. The room learned that my clarity would be consistent, and that consistency created its own calm. By the end of the season, the word responsible no longer floated unchallenged. It sat on the table like any other word subject to meaning, limits, and shared use. That was the climax. Not because it was loud, but because it was definitive. The truth had been revealed in shared light, and it changed the shape of what came next without requiring spectacle or harm to anyone involved. After Thanksgiving, the days settled into a quieter rhythm where nothing dramatic happened, yet everything felt different, as if the air had been rearranged. I noticed pauses where assumptions used to rush forward, and those pauses created space for choices I had never practiced before, without apology or announcement ever. Family conversations continued, but with careful phrasing and fewer shortcuts. And while no one named the change, it was felt in the way requests arrived. Questions replaced expectations. Timelines were discussed openly. And I was no longer positioned as the default solution to problems that were not mine to solve. I stayed consistent, which meant declining some plans and accepting others without explanation. And that consistency carried consequences that were neither punitive nor celebratory. They showed up as distance in tone, awkward pauses, and a recalibration of roles that took time to settle into something workable for everyone involved. My brother became quieter around me, not resentful, just cautious. And I allowed that caution to exist without trying to fix it. We spoke when there was something real to say, and I stopped translating silence into obligation, which reduced pressure for both of us over time, naturally enough. My parents adjusted in small, practical ways that signaled awareness. Even if understanding lagged behind behavior, invitations included options budgets were mentioned earlier, and decisions were framed as choices rather than conclusions already drawn beforehand by default alone. Often enough to change the atmosphere during visits and calls lately, overall. I noticed my own habits changing most in how I prepared for interactions by doing less rehearsal and more listening. I no longer brought spreadsheets or arguments in my head, and that absence made conversations shorter, clearer, and kinder without effort or strategy attached to outcomes we could not control. There were moments of discomfort when expectations resurfaced, and I met them with a simple no that did not require defense. Those moments passed because they were not fed, and the world did not punish me for choosing limits that were reasonable, humane, and sustainable across ordinary weeks ahead now. The aftermath was not a victory lap. It was maintenance, and maintenance is unglamorous. but it preserves systems. I focused on routines, work, rest, friendships, and steady finances. Allowing the new balance to settle without commentary or comparison to past versions of myself or them ever again going forward, quietly. I did not seek apologies, and I did not offer forgiveness speeches because both would have shifted attention away from the behavior. What mattered was continuity of boundaries and the relief that followed when choices were respected, even imperfectly, which allowed trust to rebuild slowly without pressure or performance expectations attached. As weeks passed, I felt steadier, not detached, and the calm that emerged felt earned through restraint rather than force. It confirmed that aftermaths do not need fireworks to matter and that justice can look like follow-through. Dignity and care practiced daily until peace becomes ordinary, again for good. The call came months later, on an ordinary afternoon when nothing felt charged, and that ordinariness mattered because it tested whether my resolve depended on drama or stood on its own. My brother spoke carefully and explained that he was in a tight spot and needed help to bridge a short gap. The words were familiar and measured and framed as temporary with a promise to circle back soon. He mentioned timing and pressure and how stressful it had been, and then paused, as if waiting for the old reflex to arrive. I listened without interrupting and noticed how my body stayed calm. There was no surge of irritation and no urge to justify myself. The pattern had returned, and this time I could see it clearly without fear. I responded with a single sentence and kept my voice even. I said I am not doing that anymore. If you have ever wondered whether a simple no can be enough, sit with that question for a moment. I did not add reasons or conditions, and I did not soften the boundary with apologies. The line held because it was true and complete. The silence that followed was brief and awkward, and then the conversation ended politely, without resolution. I set the phone down and went back to what I was doing. The consequence unfolded without my involvement. He pursued other options and adjusted his plans, and the outcome was not catastrophic, though it required effort on his part. That effort belonged to him, and I let it remain there. Our interactions shifted after that. They became shorter and more factual and free of expectation. We spoke about neutral topics and practical updates, and the tone settled into something cooler but respectful. I did not interpret that distance as punishment. I recognized it as a recalibration that takes time when roles change. There was no retaliation and no attempt to make me feel guilty. There was simply an absence of the old assumption. That absence was the consequence, and it was appropriate. I noticed how important it was that I did not celebrate the refusal or rehearse it later. There was nothing to prove. The boundary did not require an audience to be valid. What mattered was that it held under pressure without escalating into conflict or bargaining. That steadiness reinforced trust in myself and signaled to others that the shift was durable. Over the following weeks, similar requests did not appear, and when plans were discussed, my capacity was treated as a variable rather than a guarantee. I continued to participate where it made sense, and to decline where it did not without drama or withdrawal. The audacity return revealed something simple and useful. When boundaries are clear and consistent, they reduce the need for repeated negotiations. They also clarify relationships by removing the fog of expectation that obscures consent. I did not lose connection by saying no. I changed its shape The change came with less intensity than I had imagined, and more relief than I expected. It affirmed that justice does not require confrontation, and that dignity is preserved by choosing restraint over explanation. I kept my focus on ordinary life and allowed time to do its work. The refusal did not harden me, and it did not make me distant. It made me reliable to myself, which is a quieter form of responsibility and the one I had been missing. Over time, reflection replaced vigilance, and I began to understand what I had actually stepped away from. I had not abandoned my family, and I had not withdrawn love. I had stepped out of a role that confused endurance with care and equated silence with consent. That distinction mattered because it reframed the loss I thought I might face. What I lost was not closeness, but a script that required me to perform reliability on demand. In its place, I gained room to choose how and when I showed up. I reflected on how easily responsibility becomes a moral identity rather than a shared practice, and how praise can mask imbalance without intending harm. None of this required assigning villains. It required accuracy. When I reviewed the pattern honestly, I saw that everyone had been responding to incentives, including me. The system rewarded speed and ease, and I had provided both. Changing my behavior changed the system enough to reveal its shape. I also reflected on how fear had guided earlier decisions. I feared being seen as difficult, and I feared disrupting harmony. Those fears felt reasonable at the time, but they narrowed my options until agreement became automatic. Letting go of that fear did not make me reckless. It made me deliberate. I learned that boundaries are not walls, but agreements about capacity and timing. They invite negotiation rather than demand compliance. As I practiced this perspective, my tone softened and my expectations clarified. I stopped looking for validation and relief on other people's faces and began measuring success by how sustainable my choices felt. That shift reduced resentment before it formed. It also made generosity possible again because it was no longer compulsory. I could help without keeping track and decline without apology. Reflection also highlighted grief. I grieved the years spent mistaking duty for belonging, and the quiet hope that one more yes would finally balance the scales. Naming that grief allowed it to pass without turning into blame. I honored what had been given and what had been taken without exaggeration. This balanced view preserved dignity for everyone involved. It also grounded me in the present, where relationships could be rebuilt on clearer terms. Reflection did not demand reconciliation or distance. It offered discernment. I could see which connections grew healthier with boundaries and which required space. Accepting both outcomes felt appropriately calm. By the end of this period, reflection became less about the past and more about alignment. My actions matched my values with fewer exceptions. That alignment produced a calm that did not depend on others' approval. It prepared me to carry forward a steadier definition of responsibility, rooted in choice and care. Healing did not arrive as a single moment, but as a series of ordinary choices repeated until they felt natural. I began to notice how my days opened when I stopped bracing for requests, and how my evenings quieted when decisions belonged to me again. I kept routines simple and predictable, and that simplicity restored the energy I had been spending on anticipation. Relationships are adjusted at their own pace. Some conversations grew warmer because expectations were clearer, and some remained distant without hostility. I accepted both outcomes as information rather than judgment. The peace that followed was practical. Bills were planned without surprise, and invitations arrived with options rather than assumptions. I showed up when I could and stayed home when I could not, and neither choice required an explanation. That consistency was the medicine. It taught my nervous system that safety did not depend on constant availability. Over time, I trusted myself again. I trusted that saying yes could be generous and saying no could be kind. I trusted that care does not require me to disappear. Healing also reshaped how I understood justice. Justice was not an apology tour or a dramatic reversal. It was the quiet alignment between values and actions sustained across months. It was refusing to fund patterns that harmed me while continuing to treat people with respect. It was letting consequences unfold without narration. Dignity lived in restraint and follow-through. As the year turned, I noticed that family gatherings felt calmer, even when fewer words were exchanged. The absence of pressure created space for genuine connection when it appeared. When it did not, I did not chase it. I kept my life full with work that mattered, friendships that reciprocated, and rest that was not earned through exhaustion. Healing made room for joy that was not reactive. It was steady and unremarkable and therefore reliable. I no longer measured belonging by how quickly I fixed things. I measured it by mutual consideration and clear consent. That change did not make me harder. It made me available in healthier ways. Looking back, I see that the turning point was never about money. It was about authorship. I took authorship of my time and resources and returned them to shared spaces only by choice. That authorship transformed relationships without destroying them. Closure arrived quietly when I realized I was no longer waiting for the next test. The tests stopped because the system had changed. If you recognize yourself in this reflection, consider where responsibility has been assigned without conversation and whether clarity could restore balance. You are allowed to be careful with your energy and still be loving. You are allowed to step back and still belong. Healing is not loud. It is consistent. It is choosing peace repeatedly until peace recognizes you. I continue forward with boundaries intact and compassion steady, carrying a definition of responsibility rooted in consent, dignity, and care, and that is enough. I move ahead patiently, trusting time to reinforce what consistency began, and inviting others to meet me where mutual respect lives. Knowing that healing endures through ordinary days, choices kept, small promises honored, and peace protected without explanation or urgency ever again as life unfolds gently forward with clarity, patience, balance, care, trust, and calm within.